Our next presentation expands the conversation on historical erasure by looking at genocide through the lens of Native American and Indigenous experiences. As we've discussed throughout this conference, Hinduphobia operates through erasure, whether in the media, in history books, or in the way sacred traditions and spaces are framed. But Hindus are not alone in facing this kind of erasure. Indigenous communities across the world have experienced the systematic rewriting, silencing, and distortion of their histories, often under the guise of neutrality or progress. To explore these parallels and deepen our understanding, we're honored to welcome Delores Mondragón G. Lola G, or another name for Delores G, is a Chickasaw Chicana and a religious studies PhC at UC Santa Barbara. Her research focuses on militarism, rites of passage, rematriation, Chicanx, and Two-Spirit histories, and social justice movements. She's a descendant of Chickasaw ancestors who survived the Trail of Tears, a forced displacement that devastated Native American communities and is often misrepresented or erased altogether in mainstream narratives. Lolaji's work reminds us that erasure is never about the past. It shapes who is remembered, who is forgotten, and who gets to define history itself. Please join me in welcoming Lolaji.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I am currently on Chumash land in Ventura, California, and the title of my paper is Genocide Through the Lens of Native American and Indigenous Insidious Erasure. So hello, Chokma, Saho Chifo Dolores Lola Mondragón, Chickasaw Saya, Amintili, El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juárez, Chihuahua, Mexico. I grew up on both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border. On Choca Chafot, Ada, Oklahoma. Ako Aminti. I just said hello. My name is Dolores Lola Mondragón. I am Chickasaw. I am from El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juárez, Chihuahua, Mexico. I grew up on both sides of the border. My family is from Ada, Oklahoma. I am the daughter of Rogelio and Jennifer Mondragón. My father and his family are from Coronel, Guanajuato, Mexico. I am also Chicana, as is my daughter. My mother's mother was Phyllis Sweeney, and her mother was Jewel Sweeney, and her mother was Sally Ford, and her mother was Liza Russell. Shimohoke is my fourth great-grandmother. She died in 1903 at the age of 103, based on the Dawes Rolls, a document used to record our relatives and their blood quantum in order to qualify our racial and ethnic identities. We are the only racial and ethnic group in the United States who is issued a certificate of degree of Indian blood known as the CDIB card by the Bureau of Indian Affairs to qualify us as Native. A termination tactic that is still used today, though some tribes have chosen to not use blood quantum to qualify a family member as a citizen of their nation. The Chickasaws is one of those nations. Shimohoke, my fourth grandmother, walked the Trail of Tears and survived. Her mother was Pansakoyu. I do not know if she walked the Trail of Tears and perished, or what happened to her. I share this testimonial as an act of resistance and to compel others to learn these histories, because often, especially now, people believe that stories like ours are not worth telling, and so that is why so many people, including Native children, do not learn about Native American histories, much less about their own histories, until and if they decide to take a class in college. That is where I learned about the Trail of Tears, and yet I did not realize that was my own history until we rediscovered and reclaimed our identity as a family by enrolling in the Chickasaw Nation. Our own families had kept this history from us because my mother had married a Mexican immigrant. I will not go into the details of how problematic it is to be enrolled and qualified through the Chickasaw Nation. That is a deeper discussion for another time, but I wanted to share just a little bit of an introduction of who my people are. As a people of oral tradition, I will use repetition as an example of Native American rhetoric, but also for the purposes of remembrance. I would like to help you remember some of the stories that have been erased. I will actively pursue this endeavor here today and will use as little technology as possible, as taught to me by the late Dr. Inez Talamantes, a Mescalero Apache professor, mentor, and sister, who created the field of Native American and Indigenous religious traditions and philosophies, yet was humiliated at the same institution she dedicated 50 years of her life. She would take us to ceremonies and to the land and often cautioned her students to go slow, be still, be gentle, and compassionate as a way to decolonize from the fast pace of modernity who had made our people invisible. So I honor these sacred ways of knowing and learning as I sit with you today. Chikasha nompa anompolili, chokma kio. I do not speak Chickasaw very well, but thanks to our nation's recent language revitalization initiatives, we have access to learning our language using a dictionary, an app, and even Rosetta Stone. The U.S. government worked actively to rid and erase Native American peoples like my ancestors, elders, me, my children, and grandchildren through any genocidal tactics at their disposal. They took away our lands, used extermination and assimilation policies, including boarding schools, to take away our culture, language, and families, as well as our religious freedoms that some Native elders say are still not restored, despite the passage of the American Indian Religious Freedom Act passed in 1978, which allowed Native Americans the right to exercise their religious traditions, including ceremonies, access to sacred sites, and allowance to use and access sacred objects and medicines. I was alive when it was not allowed for me to practice my medicine, and it was against the law. I, like many others, am a displaced Chickasaw person. After U.S. American President Andrew Jackson disregarded the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Worcester versus Georgia, a ruling that settled Georgia could not enforce laws against the Cherokee Nation on the nation's land because it violated their sovereignty. By signing the Indian Removal Act into law in 1830, President Jackson sanctioned genocide, leading to the forced migration known as the Trail of Tears, devastating tribal nations and leading to the death of thousands of Native Americans who died from starvation, disease, and inhuman hardship and suffering. Yet many can't or don't know that an American Holocaust forever changed a whole people's way of life. The intergenerational trauma is now evident with epigenetic markers that show how DNA has been altered in subsequent generations. Yet there is further injury, which is the continued insidious trauma of internalized oppression that prevent many Native peoples from seeking out their ways of knowing, their languages, cultural traditions, ceremonies, rites of passage, and all facets of quotidian life that were taken. And these are some of the residues of erasure through racism. President Jackson believed Native Americans could not adapt to white society, even as they kidnapped and took children away to boarding schools where half of them died. He ascribed to the entrenched justification of treachery known as manifest destiny, where the U.S. government had and still believes it has a divine right and racial superiority to claim lands, to be possessed and used, to be extracted from and profited from indiscriminately. And we are seeing all of that replay today. Many peoples and countries continue to suffer from the legacy of this white supremacist ethos, and often because of erasure, blame the people themselves or those colonized self-blame for the lack of resources, opportunities, health, comorbidities, or educational attainment, unaware that these are the very real symptoms and consequences of settler colonialism. I share this history because we are seeing a return of dehumanizing tactics through immigration executive orders, dislocation of families with mixed immigration status, households, weakening of the judiciary and legislative branches of government, as well as a very visible return of varied iterations of manifest destiny, including an expansion of racial superiority as seen with the rise of anti-Semitic sentiment and outright displays of and embracement of the return of Nazism. By delegitimizing decades of work with the demonization and extermination of DI programs, we are witnessing a weakening and active erasure of decades of humanitarian achievements, especially after the Civil Rights Movement. The nullifying of decades of progress done to rectify the residues caused by assimilation policies, including boarding schools, the Jim Crow era, slavery, and other insidious forms of genocidal policies that devastated said communities is unfathomable. The lie often told to these same oppressed populations that meritocracy alone will dissolve centuries of injury, poverty, and suffering is one of the worst moral injuries for young minds. Hopeful of a future displayed as fair and just when they learn of these histories and erasures. This is why conferences like these are important. It is our responsibility to share these histories when we learn them and mitigate the effects of epistemic violence. Erasure works to also make invisible the hands of those making the rules, who remain gatekeepers in service of settler colonialism, white supremacy, sexism, ableism, and homophobia against the other, including people of color, women, LGBTQIA, and Two-Spirit peoples. Erasure is one of the most effective tools to disempowering communities, and its practice persists, as has been evident here in the US with historical revisionism, book bans, and the elimination of DEI initiatives, programs, and funding. As a descendant of ancestors who survived the Trail of Tears and is still living the consequence of assimilation policies, because our language, culture, and ceremonies were outlawed and banned, and acceptance of Two-Spirit peoples as sacred were denied, erased, and persecuted, it is important to point out the detriment that has been caused in our communities, even by our own people who struggle with internalized oppression and who too employ Christian doctrine to dehumanize LGBTQIA, Two-Spirit folks, and undocumented immigrants as they use them as scapegoats as a means to revive and reinvigorate the erasure of multicultural, multi-faith, multi-ethnic communities by minimizing the importance of sharing everyone's stories and by attempted purging. As a form of rebellion, reversion, and to continue pushing against erasure, I share 3 short stories of survivance, a combination of the words survival and resistance, a term coined by V. Señor, an Anishinaabe scholar, who said survivance is, quote, an active sense of presence, the continuance of Native stories, not a mere reaction or survivable name. Native survivance stories are renunciations of dominance, tragedy, and victimry. Survivance means the right of succession or reversion of an estate, and in that sense, the estate of native survivancy. Unquote. With regards to land, the first story is of the active efforts always at the forefront of native life, and if it can and if it can, seems short-lived. For example, Native Americans are regaining their land, including sacred sites through land back movement, grants, gifting by private donors, and through buyback programs. The Department of the Interior, through the buyback program, helped Native peoples reclaim nearly 3 million acres in 15 states. Deb Haaland, the first ever Native American person to occupy the position as State of the Interior in the previous administration, reminded us of the active efforts and successes that come from survivancy, including persistence, prayer, and tenacity. She said, quote, assimilation policies not only attempted to break apart Indigenous families, devastate ecosystems, and eliminate native languages, they also work to weaken land claims and tribal land ownership. The checkerboard system of land ownership on many reservations historically left communities and landowners unable to make basic decisions about their homelands. The land buyback program Progress puts the power back in the hand of tribal communities to determine how their lands are used for conservation, from conservation to economic development projects, unquote. The second story talks about the many efforts made on a grassroots level and the activism and violence experienced in order to protect Mother Earth, including the use of rubber bullets, dogs being seeked onto bodies, and the spraying of tear gas, as witnessed by the Standing Rock protest, where thousands came together to make a concerted effort to prevent the Dakota Access Pipeline, known as DAPL, from threatening the water supply, destroying burial sites, and violating the Fort Laramie Treaty, designating the Standing Rock Sioux tribe rightful sovereignty over their lands. Though DAPL was halted under President Obama, President Trump had it completed, and it crosses under Lake Oahe, the Mississippi River, as well as the Missouri River. The prayer is always present that the water remains safe, as it is a sacred medicine and a being worthy of care. The last story is but the sharing of Stephen Newcomb's definition of rematriation, which pushes against the patriarchal legacy applied when only using repatriation or the possession as the only thing of value. When he writes, quote, by rematriation, I mean to restore a living culture to its rightful place on Mother Earth, or to restore a people to a spiritual way of life in sacred relationship with their ancestral lands without external interference. As a concept, rematriation acknowledges that our ancestors lived in spiritual relationship with our lands for thousands of years, and that we have a sacred duty to maintain that relationship for the benefit of future generations. Unquote. I share his definition because it explains one of the reasons that we cannot go extinct, even if there are only 80,000 Chickasaws presently, the 12th largest nation in the U.S., indigenous nation in the U.S., with not one single first language native speaker alive. We also need accomplices, not really allies, as we move forward continuing our efforts to recover lands. We have a sacred duty to protect the land and all other beings, not only for all of us, but for future generations, as I stated in his definition. So we need accomplices that will actively work towards mitigating the implementation of genocidal tactics through many means, including erasure, that get reproduced generation after generation. I invite you to learn more of and from the vast number of Indigenous peoples and nations throughout Turtle Island. And as a last share on allyship versus accomplices from scholars committed to change, as evident in the title of their book, Red Nation Rising, From Border Town Violence to Native Liberation, authored by Melanie Yazzie, David Correa, Jennifer Nez, Detendali, and Nick Estes, I share their scholarship and sacred work here to make you familiar with them. They write, quote, "Those who enter into a relationship of solidarity and alliance with an oppressed or colonized group may hold sympathetic views and offer important resources and support, but they do not necessarily possess the political development for, quote, wokeness, unquote, that would allow for full long-term alignment with more radical demands associated with social and environmental justice." And their solidarity or alliance with these groups typically doesn't translate into a dramatic reversal of their own social locations, which keeps the inequalities and therefore the systems of oppression between those calling for solidarity and alliance and those answering these calls intact. Some have gone as far as to call for disposing of, quote, allies, unquote, to make way for, quote, accomplices, unquote, which implies stricter criteria for who engages in allyship and more extreme measures of accountability. I want to thank everyone, Sneha especially, for the invitation to your conference today. Chokmashki. And I wish you a good, gentle, compassionate journey as you move forward in this work, which is extremely important and very honorable work. Thank you for your time.
Dhanyavad Lola ji for sharing these powerful insights. Your work reminds us that erasure is not just an absence, it is an active force that determines whose stories are told, whose suffering is acknowledged, and whose voices are heard. The experiences you've shared today resonate deeply with the themes of this conference, the marginalization of Indigenous histories, whether Native American, Chicanx, or Hindu, is not accidental. It's part of a broader pattern that reinforces power imbalances and maintains historical amnesia. But as we've seen today, communities are fighting back, not just by reclaiming their histories, but by ensuring that future generations remember what has been erased. Once again, let's extend our gratitude to Lola ji for her wisdom, her scholarship, and her powerful voice in this conversation. In our last session, Dolores G spoke about how Indigenous communities, particularly Native American and Chicanx peoples, have faced systematic erasure, not only through physical displacement and destruction, but through the rewriting of their histories and suppression of their spiritual traditions.